Hello, and welcome to Basics to Brilliance Haematology Podcast, the podcast series that will take your basic haematology knowledge up to a level needed to be an effective haematology registrar. We hope that the content we cover here will help you prepare for the dreaded Haematology FRC Path Part 1 examination. But most importantly, we hope that this series fills you with excitement for the fantastic, dynamic and highly rewarding specialty of haematology. My name is Dr. Anharad Everden, Haematology ST5 Registrar in the South West Deanery.
And my name's Dr. David Fazy, Haematology SHO, with aspirations to be a Haemareg.
And let's get started on today's topic.
From basics
to brilliance. Okay, hi David.
Hello.
Lovely to see you again. So
yes, happy to be here.
Yeah, good. Today we are going to be talking about, well, last time we talked about the use of a lab clotting screen, so the PT and the APTT, and we talked about the use of that in the context of the clinical history. And today, as promised, I think we should now start thinking a bit more about, okay, so we know roughly how to interpret these results, but how are they actually conducted in the lab? Because actually also understanding that will help us to interpret what these clotting tests mean for our patient.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Mostly because, we send them off and something mystical happens and a number comes back. Yeah. It's usually red or black and you're like, okay, fine. So it'd probably be useful for us mere medics who don't get in the lab to sort of quiz you a little bit, if I can sort of offer it that way around.
I think that's a really good idea because I think we really need to make sure that we're starting from a common place that everyone starts from. And I think clotting, particularly practical haemostasis, like how the tests are run, is really not taught at medical school and not well understood. And actually a little bit of knowledge about this is probably quite helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I can assure you that I can set a very low baseline, so we should be okay.
So where do you want to start then, David?
So let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
We send off a sample to the lab, and they report a value back to us. But how do they actually measure a clot? What is it measured in? How do you quantify it, a clot? Okay.
Have you noticed the units that your PT and your APTT come back as?
So they come back in seconds.
Right.
But I don't know, what qualifies a clot? Am I at 100% clot, 50%? When do they click the button on the timer?
Okay, that's a really good question. So basically, when we're doing both our PT and our APTT and a lot of our clotting tests in the lab that we'll talk about later as well, what we're actually measuring is the time taken from adding all the ingredients that are required to allow the clotting cascade to start, and that's when the timer starts, to then actually measuring the formation of a clot. And when the clot is formed, the timer stops. And so I think your question is, okay, well, how do the lab machines even know when the clot's formed? And something I really recommend is going into the lab, and I've done this with my own blood sample, which was a lot of fun, and getting your blood sample and actually getting it in a little watch glass, which you can then agitate, and you can move it around and move it around. You add all your ingredients, you start your timer, you move the watch glass around, and you look to see when basically the blood looks like it's clotted. And that's when you stop your timer. So back in the day when these tests were first formed, that's how we measured our clotting time and got our PT and our APTT. Okay. Obviously, we don't have loads of biomedical scientists in the lab moving watch glasses around. And obviously, also, it's not particularly accurate just based on me thinking that it looks, that looks pretty kind of clotted up now. I'll stop the timer. So thankfully, we have much better methods.
I feel like quality control is going to be a bit awful if it's Anharad based.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and also NetQuest would, we'll talk about NetQuest another time, but there's lots of things that enforce quality control within the lab. But basically everything is now automated, and there are two main ways in which the automated machines detect the formation of a clot and basically stop the timer at that point. One method is photo-optical, which is where basically as the clot forms, it changes the density to light, incident light. And so you have light coming in one side, going through your sample, and as the clot forms, more light gets scattered and less gets transmitted. And you get a detector on the other side measuring basically the change in light intensity.
Okay.
So that's one method. The other method is a mechanical method where you basically have movement of a magnetic ball or two probes in relation to each other, which basically the movement becomes more and more retarded as the fibrin clot forms. So as the fibrin forms. Obviously, we haven't got platelets in these samples because it's a very artificial lab test. But instead, what we're measuring is the formation of fibrin, which then makes the substance either turbid so that light doesn't pass through, or basically retards movement of a magnetic ball, for example, and changes a current measured. Okay?
And those two, I guess, are standardized to each other?
Yes. Yeah. They can be used interchangeably. So as far as I'm aware, a lab will have either one kind or the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So I've been thinking about this as an example. I hope it doesn't throw you too much. I do a lab test. I do an appropriate hematology certified bloodletting of someone, and I send off a blue tube to the lab for clotting, and it comes back with a shortened APTT and a
Okay.
normal PT. And I'm like, I don't really understand how that's happened. How can this person be more, extra clotty if it's sort of standardized blood sample? So how does that kind of happen?
Yeah, that's a really good case. Actually, I get called about this quite a lot, and often you'll see the lab will write next to a shortened APTT, partially activated sample, and that can actually just add confusion where people are like, "What does this mean?" And I think a more key point to draw out of this case that you describe is if a clotting test that you've done for a specific reason, because you've taken a history and you are concerned for some reason about someone's clotting, comes back as a wonky result where you're like, wasn't expecting that, then the first thing to do is just repeat it. And that's because, a lot of the time it can be explained by what we call pre-analytical variables, and the majority of errors in the lab are due to what we call pre-analytical variables. So things that change, which cause a change in the result of your clotting test, which have occurred before the actual analysis by the machine. So let's consider those for a minute. You've got three kind of main headings of which these come under. Think about it in terms of blood being collected, so that process and where things can go wrong there. Then your sample handling, and then your patient-specific factors, so things that are actually because the patient has a certain condition which is affecting the clotting but isn't a true representation of what might be going on. So if we start with sample collection, one of the most important things is about taking the blood correctly. So having a well-trained phlebotomist who can firstly do a clean atraumatic venipuncture. So they're not putting the needle in and wiggling it about. Because if they put the needle in and wiggle it about loads because they're finding it really difficult to bleed the patient, then that's what can cause this case that you describe of a shortened APTT or a partially activated sample. And it's basically because the clotting cascade has already started to be activated in the patient's body, rather than in the lab when we add all the ingredients to start the cascade. And so therefore, by the time it hits the lab, it's already kind of gone halfway, and therefore it will make it look shortened. Other things you need to think about in terms of sample collection are making sure that you take your blood tubes in the right order. So that you always take a clotting screen before you take a full blood count, for example, to prevent EDTA from contaminating your clotting tube, which we'll come back to. You also need to make sure there's the correct amount of blood in the tube. I am sure you have,
Oh my word.
once in your life at least,
oh my word,
been phoned.
The bane of my existence.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's really important though. And I used to not understand this at all. Like, why are the lab being so difficult? This patient's really difficult to bleed. I'd get as much blood as I could in the blue tube. And then I'd write on the request form, like, please, really difficult patient to bleed, please process it. Thinking that maybe the lab staff were just being really mean and want more blood. But this is not the case at all. It's actually because you've got to get the right amount of blood in the tube to make sure that the ratio of citrate to blood is correct. So is a 1:9 ratio of citrate to blood. Because if you underfill it, then what happens if you have a spuriously prolonged clotting result, because you've basically got too much citrate that's binding all of your clotting factors, so that when you add your ingredients to restart clotting in the lab, not all of it is reversed, and you're not able to start all of your clotting cascade in the lab. And likewise, If you overfill it, that can also cause a problem where you get a spirally shortened clotting test. So that could be another reason why you had your shortened APTT, is maybe the patient, maybe the blood bottle was overfilled. So that's another thing that you need to consider.
So those first two are both me problems. Middle of the night trying to take blood, wiggling it around, or didn't do what I was told to by the lab.
Exactly.
Okay.
By either by over or underfilling the tube, or by taking a clotting sample after you take a full blood count, for example. So that's important. So sample collection. Then the second thing is sample handling. So most blood tests need to be run within about 4 hours of collection. Obviously, the PT was designed to monitor warfarin. So actually, that's got a 24-hour stability, which is useful given that it was designed to be monitoring warfarin in, an outpatient setting. And an APTT, if you're sending that to monitor someone on unfractionated heparin, that should really be run within an hour, because any longer than an hour and those platelets start releasing platelet factor 4 into the tube, and that can then neutralize the heparin and give you spurious results. And then there are very specific things like freeze thawing really isn't advised for samples that are being done to look for a lupus anticoagulant, like we talked about last time. And that's because if you freeze thaw a sample, you can break open platelets and release phospholipid, the membranes of the platelets, and then that can mop up the antibody and neutralize it, so you then don't detect it on your lab tests. So those are your sort of factors in terms of sample handling. And then lastly, you've got to consider patient-specific factors. So there may be other things going on with the patient which result in you getting an incorrect clotting result, which doesn't mean that there's a problem that someone's done in the lab. So they have this acronym HIL, the HIL index, and this is basically hemolysis, which true hemolysis, which happens, inside the body, can cause clotting factor activation. It's a very procoagulant state to be in, versus false or in vitro hemolysis from the sample being shaken up too much. Icterus is then, and lipemia are two other things that can affect the results that you get in the lab, because if you've got the photo-optical methods we were talking about, then both a very yellow sample or a very lipid-filled sample are both going to affect the amount of light that can be absorbed, that can pass through and be absorbed, and so it interferes with the ability of the machine to detect the clot, and so then the machine doesn't really know when to stop the timer, basically. And then, of course, other things like, one of the most common things is the patient on an anticoagulant that the medical team failed to put on the request form.
That's never happened. Never happened.
Of course, no. Yeah. And then you've also got things like antibodies. So certain antibodies like rheumatoid factor sometimes, certain paraproteins, these can interfere with the tests. And then another classic thing, which is not really a clotting test so much, but is a test you would do in the context of someone you're worried about bleeding, as a full blood count. And when you do a full blood count, sometimes you'll get a spuriously low platelet count, and that's because the patient's got an antibody that's EDTA induced. So you need to have it in the presence of EDTA. This antibody will bind the patient's own platelets and clump them together, called platelet clumping. And when that happens, then the machine goes, oh God, there must be only 10 platelets. But actually, there are a hell of a lot more, but they're all just clumped, so the machine hasn't detected them. And have you ever had that situation, and have you had to speak to haematology?
Yeah, I think often I've kind of had those come back, and I note that they almost instantly put it through for a blood film, and then usually there's a report just saying platelet clumping or something like that, or please repeat sample.
Yeah,
which I've seen. Yeah,
yeah, and I often get anaesthetist phoning me saying, "Oh, this patient's got platelet clumping, whatever that means, and their platelets are 20, and we want to take them to theatre." So in that situation, can you think of any way we could get a true platelet count? It does not involve us counting platelets on the blood.
Okay.
You'll be pleased to know.
Yes, I was going to say, are there any other tubes that don't have an EDTA in that we can run samples from?
Very good. Yeah, so you can what you can do is ask the lab to run a full blood count on a citrate sample. So you can send a blue top tube and then say, look, spoken to haematology, they're a platelet clumper, please can you do a full blood count on this sample, and they'll be able to do that.
Grand.
Good. So those are your pre-analytical variables. So basically what I'm trying to say is if a clotting screen like that comes back really weird and you're not expecting it and you can't put it together with the clinical picture, before you start going down really kind of rogue routes, just check, hang on, is this actually a pre-analytical variable, and repeat it in the first place. I mean, one of the common things we see on the haematology ward, of course, is patients with lines and you get heparin contamination of the lines. That's really common.
Yep. It feels like the haematology equivalent to turn it off and back on again.
Yeah, exactly. Or once I remember I sent bloods to the lab using an ABG syringe. I can't remember why, but that's also coated in heparin. And so the lab were like, what is going on? This is a bizarre sample. And I was like, no, there's nothing wrong. And then it was only later I was like, oh God, that will be why. So pre-analytical variables
that'll do
really
it.
important. Yeah.
Okay. So we've mentioned a lot of different tubes. A blue, a purple, and a yellow so far, I think.
Yeah.
And I know that most of them go in that sort of blue or citrate tube you've mentioned. I had a recent one where I sent a normal blue. The APTT was prolonged, and they then asked for a yellow. I think it was for lupus anticoagulant, but
Yeah.
I suddenly was like, I do what I'm told with the tube colors, but I
Okay.
don't really know what's going on. Could you
Yeah.
shed some light from the lab side?
Yeah, sure. To understand this, first of all, do you know what EDTA or citrate do?
Let's assume no.
Okay, that's fine. So EDTA and citrate are two substances which basically chelate calcium, and your clotting cascade needs calcium to work. Okay, so when we're doing our APTT and our PT and our other clotting tests, calcium is always one of the ingredients that we add to start the clotting cascade. So it's really helpful to know this because it means that when we collect the blood from the patient, what we really want to do is then freeze and pause the patient's clotting cascade, because we want to restart it in the lab in a nice controlled manner where we can start a stopwatch at the time that the clotting cascade starts. To be able to do this, we need to freeze the clotting cascade as soon as that blood arrives in the tube, until we get it to the lab and we're ready to go again. So the way in which we do this and the way we control when the clotting cascade starts is by chelating calcium. So we chelate it so it's not available for the clotting cascade. And there are two substances that do this, EDTA and citrate. Now, EDTA is what you find in a purple top, which is used to send a full blood count. And EDTA basically chelates calcium in a sort of irreversible way, if you like. And that's because there is no situation in which we're going to want to restart the clotting cascade when we're trying to measure a full blood count. Because when we're measuring a full blood count, we want the cells to not clot together and lump.
Yeah.
And we want to put them through the machine, and count them, basically. So that's why we have EDTA in our purple top, and that's why a full blood count goes in that one. In contrast, citrate the block that it causes, the chelation that it causes of the calcium, can be overcome by adding calcium back. So what we do is we collect the blood into a citrated tube when we do clotting, and we then add a known amount of calcium as our ingredients when we want to restart clotting in the lab. So it's a reversible way of pausing the clotting cascade until we're ready to measure it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense.
And that's why we're obsessed with the line, how much we
that makes sense now.
Because otherwise we're going to add a set amount of calcium to the tube in the lab.
Yep.
And that if you've overfilled it, then that's going to be that's going to be too little. And if you've underfilled it, either way, you need to give the right amount. So
it always felt so personal when it was rejected, and now I realise no, it's just the way that the test works.
Yeah, exactly. So that's your citrated sample, which is your blue top, and then you said the gold top as well, or the yellow top. So that's actually looking at serum. So I guess what is serum? Well, you've got whole blood, which is blood, clotting factors, plasma. Okay. Then when we want to do clotting tests, we get rid of the cells and we just do plasma. Okay. So what we do is we take the blood and we spin it down, and then we just basically take stuff off the top, and in particular right off the top. So it's the platelet poor plasma, which is what we use as our main ingredient in the lab to test clotting. And then if we want to do a test for like an antibody, then we want to just look at serum. Now, serum is blood plasma, which has had its clotting factors removed, because they just kind of get in the way, and it's just better to have a sample that's not got clotting factors, not got cells, and then we can just, go to town with checking for antibodies and stuff, which is what the gold top's used for, as well as biochemistry. So how we do that is we allow the blood to clot. So there's nothing to chelate calcium in the gold top. We allow the blood to clot as soon as it hits the thing. And sometimes I remember, like, as an F1 being like, oh God, it's clotted already. Oh no. But that's fine because it's a gold top. So it clots. And then what we do is, you might have noticed in the bottom of a gold top, there's like a bit of like clear jelly stuff.
There's some goop, isn't there? Yeah.
There's goop, exactly. And that is designed to basically hold, when we centrifuge the sample, all the pellet of cells will stick into that gloop at the bottom, along with the clotting factors that have made a big clot. And then we can prepare off the top when we've got serum.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is quite cool.
Yeah. I told you.
You're drawing me in.
I'm drawing them in, exactly. So that is a good question about the different tubes, but that's what those are the tubes that we have.
Okay, great. So we've covered a little bit of it, but maybe we should just get into the nitty gritty. And can you tell us how, when I send a PT test, what happens? Talk me through it.
Okay, well, the PT stands for the prothrombin time, which is a bit of a misleading term, to be honest, but so we'll just call it a PT. But basically, I like to think of these clotting tests as like baking a cake. So we've got various ingredients that we need to put in the test tube. So we start with the blood of the patient, and as we've said, we put it in a citrated tube, so the calcium is all chelated. So we call this basically like a decalcified plasma. We then spin it so that we get rid of the cells, and then we pipette right off of the top of it, as I said, so that we've got a platelet poor plasma, or a PPP. And the reason why we want it to be platelet poor is we just want to remove platelets from measuring the clotting cascade, because we don't want the number of the patient's platelets or the function of the patient's platelets to affect what we're trying to isolate here. So in a very non-physiological way, we're trying to isolate just the clotting cascade and the clotting factors. So that secondary hemostasis part, okay? So if we're removing platelets to get rid of that as a variable, then we need to add a source of phospholipid. So that we therefore add phospholipid to our test tube. So we've now got decalcified platelet poor plasma. We've got a set amount of phospholipid. And then we've also got tissue factor, because we know that's what activates the extrinsic pathway, which is what the PT is measuring. And then to start it all off, to get it going, we have to re-add calcium. So we add calcium chloride. And then we start our timer. And this is all done at 37 degrees, so i.e. physiological. And we start our timer and we measure the time taken until a clot forms, and then we stop our timer. And then that gives us our PT, which is usually going to be between 13 and 15 seconds. So it's actually pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Any questions about
that? So you've said this a couple of times, and it's sort of stuck in my head. Is you've said that PT is a bit of a misnomer. We actually made it to measure warfarin, but from all my experience, whenever we measure warfarin, we use an INR. So why don't we just use the PT to? Why isn't the PT the variable that we measure warfarin in?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, and I'm really glad you asked that. So we then use the PT to calculate an INR. And the reason for that is, I should say that in our ingredients, the tissue factor and the phospholipid, we call those two things together. It's an old-fashioned term, but it's called thromboplastin, which is that combination of phospholipid and tissue factor. And I think it's called that because I think it used to be made from like mashed, it might still be, but made from like mashed brain of like a rabbit or some sort of animal, because there's tons of phospholipid around the neurons in your brain. And tissue factor, I think, is a pretty ubiquitous kind of substance found in most cells when they're damaged. So thromboplastin is basically like a bit of mashed brain. And if you are having to get phospholipid and tissue factor from a sort of physiological source somewhere, then one rabbit's brain might be different to another rabbit's brain. So let's say Truro Lab use a specific breed of rabbit. I don't know why I'm going down the rabbit route, but let's just say they use this.
You could say we are going down a rabbit hole.
I really am.
Yes, that's why I'm here. Useless at haematology, but every now and again.
So yeah, let's say Truro are using a specific type of rabbit mashed brain as their ingredient, and then Derriford are using a different type of rabbit mashed brain. You're going to get two different PTs because for the same patient, right? And that's not useful, because if someone goes on holiday, let's say they live in Devon and they go on holiday to Truro, then and they want to get their warfarin checked because they take warfarin all the time, and they want to check that their warfarin's still at the right dose, then that's not going to be very helpful if the PT is variable between labs. So that's why we do the INR, which stands for International. What's it stand for? The
normalized ratio.
International Normalized Ratio. Thank you. And that is basically calculated by doing the patient's PT divided by a normal patient or a control patient's PT, and then raised to the power of this thing called an ISI, which stands for International Sensitivity Index. And basically what I think of as the ISI is like the fiddle factor. So if you look on the bottles of like lab reagents, they come with an ISI, and it basically allows you to compare this rabbit's mashed brain to this rabbit's mashed brain. So the Truro one and the Derriford one. And so it allows you to therefore standardize your PT measurement as an INR across all the different labs in the UK. So you could go on holiday to Norfolk and, you know, your INR is still...
Why would you do that?
Oh, careful. I hope.
Oh, yeah. No, our 3 viewers from Norfolk have just left.
So that's why we do the INR. So that's a good question. And I guess leading on to that as well, I probably should have told you about another ingredient that we do add to measure the PT, which is also some sort of like heparin neutralising buffer. Okay. And we do that to stop heparin from affecting, because heparin is predominant, well, both of its effects are on the common pathway. So both, against 2, clotting factor 2, and against 10, or 10A and 2A. And so they would potentially, therefore, heparin would affect your PT and your APTT. So deliberately, we've added a heparin neutralising buffer to the PT so that we can measure the PT and know that it's not going to be affected by heparin. Why is that useful? Well, because when you're loading a patient on warfarin for a clot, if they've had an acute clot as opposed to something else like, I don't know, AF, then you're going to want to cover them with heparin, with low molecular weight heparin, whilst you get their INR into target range, or if it dips at any point in the first 6 weeks or whatever. And if your heparin affects your INR, it's going to be a total nightmare to know when you're in range. And actually, I have this experience from patients when they've got heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, and we put them on an IV argatroban infusion, and because they've got bad renal failure, and that's the only hepatically metabolized one. Then when we then load them on warfarin to get them home as an outpatient, it's really difficult to know what's affecting the INR, because both argatroban and warfarin both affect the INR. And so you have to give it a prolonged period of days of a very high INR to know that you're probably in range with the warfarin before you stop the argatroban. So it's really useful that there's also a heparin neutralising buffer in the PT, and we do that because we use the PT to calculate the INR, basically to monitor warfarin, which is what it was designed to do.
Rant over.
Yes. Sorry if that came across as that.
No. It's very interesting.
It's just an important detail.
It's useful to know.
Yeah, because otherwise it makes it a bit confusing. It's like, well, if we go back to first principles from the last podcast, why is it that your unfractionated heparin and your low molecular weight heparin isn't affecting your PT? I was like, I can't understand this.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. And so shall we move on to the APTT?
Yes, please. Fire away.
So, what do you think we use from the patient this time?
Say it again.
So what do you think we use from the patient this time? Is it going to be the same thing in terms of the sample that we take?
So we're still going to take the same sample, aren't we? In terms of our blood test.
Yeah.
I guess we are going to want phospholipid again, but we're not going to want tissue factor.
Very
That's the
good.
things we're adding. Yeah.
Yeah. And the clue's in the name with this one. So unlike
Is it the partial bit? I've never understood the partial bit. I'm just like,
now you do though, David,
yeah.
because thromboplastin is your phospholipid and tissue factor. It's that
Yeah.
old-fashioned term of the MASH brain, right? So
Yeah.
an activated partial thromboplastin time is because we want part of the thromboplastin. We want the phospholipid part, but we don't want the tissue factor part.
Got it.
Okay, so because instead we're going to be activating the intrinsic pathway. So into our cake mixture this time goes our platelet poor plasma, which has been decalcified so that it can't clot yet. And we then have to add our phospholipid to provide the surface for the clotting cascade to occur because we've removed all the platelets. And then
I guess we need something to kickstart it.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we're not giving tissue factor.
Exactly. Yeah. So what we use is we need to use what's called a contact activator. So what we tend to use is micronized silica. So like little silica beady things, basically. It used to be the substance called kaolin, but we don't use that very much anymore. I think because it used to be, it's quite turbid. And so now that we have these automated methods, it's not so good for, the machines that are using the photo-optical method. So instead we use micronized silica. We use phospholipid, which is often called keflin in this situation, and we use our platelet poor plasma, all incubated at 37 degrees. And then when we're ready to start our timer, we add our calcium chloride. That starts the clotting cascade, this time via the intrinsic pathway, and goes all the way down. And then we stop the timer when the clot forms. And that will give us an APTT between 27 and 35 seconds. And that's it. Also pretty simple, actually.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? That's what I find very satisfying about practical haemostasis is it makes sense. It's all very logical, which is I find quite satisfying.
Grand.
And that's it.
Yes. I feel like those are our initial tests, aren't they? And then if there are any other problems, we start getting into the deeps of mixing studies, which I think is a gem we're going to hold for next time. Yeah,
exactly. So next time what we'll talk about is mixing studies, which is what we do to try and work out if something is prolonged due to an inhibitor or a deficiency. So super useful tests, and you'll see a lot of them come back on your clotting report. Our lab in Truro used to just go on and do that straight away. I think it's part of their SOPs. So there's more stuff for you to interpret and to get confused about potentially. And we'll also talk next time about the process of measuring a thrombin time and why that's useful, and compare that to a Klaus fibrinogen, because those two tests are actually very similar, although a lot of people don't realise that. And so we'll talk about the lab basis of them.
Lovely.
So lots to look forward to. Do you have any questions from anything that we've covered today, David?
No, I think I'm good. It's like you said, when you go back to principles, you can kind of work out where the problem is.
Yeah.
What usually happens is something flags up in the lab and you don't know how to interpret it, and the first thing you do is ring someone like yourself and ask the question, and actually you could probably do a lot of the groundwork yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And so now we know when to order the clotting screen, we know how to interpret it and what might cause prolonged results, and we also know what might cause shortened results and pre-analytical variables. We know that if we get a dodgy result, then the first thing to do is repeat it and think, has there been an error made? And we now also know how to bake a cake, both a PT one and an APTT one.
Absolutely.
Great.
Lovely. Go for it.
I was just going to say, we should say a big thank you to Hader for all the editing that he's doing for us in the background.
Yes, the technological wizardry that we're just not capable of. So Hader, thank you so much for your time and making us sound reasonable.
Great. All right.
I'll see you next time.
Yep. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening to Basics to Brilliance Haematology Podcast. If you enjoy our series, please don't forget to like, leave a review, and hit subscribe to never miss an episode. See you next time.